I welcome everyone on behalf of LexQuest Foundation to this policy dialogue session in climate change mitigation for India. Our speaker for today, as you all know, is Dr. Michael Mehling. A very warm welcome to Dr. Mehling, and thanks a lot for being with us today. Dr. Mehling needs no introduction, and I'm sure that all among our audience are aware of his works on environmental policies. So we would directly move to the questions. Meanwhile, you can keep writing down your questions in the chat box, and Dr. Mehling can take that up gradually. So thank you, Dr. Mehling, for being here. I start with my first question. So as we all know, and you worked on it, on the Paris Agreement, it is one of the major international interventions in terms of building a consensus towards climate change. The policy directive of the Trump administration has been to kind of exit from this Paris Agreement. And it did in November 4th of 2020. But Joe Biden, as we all know, the president-elect, is saying that he's going to take America back to signing the Paris Agreement. So given that this change in presidency is expected to huge change in foreign policy in India, do you think that there is, an effect on climate mitigation policies in India due to this change of approach in American presidency?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be speaking here. I see with great happiness that I even recognize some of the participants, and I've had the pleasure and privilege to engage with them in the past. So it's a great topic for a Saturday. I would say, generally speaking, of course, it will have an implication. If you look at domestic policymaking in India, I think it will help a lot that the largest economy of the world is not hiding, behind its own borders and doing nothing, or at least seeming to do nothing. Of course, the picture has always been more complex in the United States at the subnational level of states and even cities, where there is a lot more happening than you think when you only see what's being said or broadcast from the White House. But those perceptions really are important. And I think in many countries, when there's already sort of domestic struggles to justify and argue for the need for accelerated policy ambition, it makes it harder when critics that are pushing back against such an agenda can say, well, how about the United States? If they don't do anything, why should we? If we move forward, might we not expose ourselves to economic burdens and even competitiveness impacts that they are avoiding? And they have more money, they have more means, they should be moving first. So I think that is one important thing that is hopefully going to be less of a factor if at least the US again starts moving, and instead of providing munition for critics, actually gives munition for those who want to support domestic climate action all around the world in countries, really in their domestic climate politics. But there's another very important thing that I think is sometimes not considered fully enough, and that is that when a large country like the United States, with so many resources, with such a large economy, with so many consumers, of course, as well, decide to push forward with climate action, and in particular, the specific agenda of President-elect Biden, which is heavily focused on investing a lot in transformation, in technology development and deployment, in infrastructure, etc. There are very, very beneficial spillover effects of that. And I'll just point out, for instance, the story of renewable energy, which India has been able to take a very important role in now, become a champion. But it was sort of made possible in part because some countries, it was especially in Europe, where I'm from, that 25 years ago started sort of promoting at relatively high cost, but it was still a niche thing, investing in solar photovoltaics, etc., driving down the cost of those technologies and making them a feasible, competitive option, even in countries where, investing in more expensive technologies would not be realistic. But at the point where those technologies have become so much cheaper that they can compete on market, in the market without policy support with incumbent carbon intensive policies, you do open up entirely new possibilities. And I think, and I hope, because even though on renewable energy, we've seen a lot of progress, and I'm very emboldened and glad to see that around the world, this opportunity is being picked up. There are still many areas of technological development where we're very early yet. And if you think of what all the big sort of scenarios that see us achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement predict, we will need heavily negative emissions technologies such as carbon removal, carbon capture and sequestration with bioenergy, and so on and so forth. And those we don't yet have. And I hope that one of the things that the US, if it starts pushing faster again and using, deploying its significant resources in the right direction, is that it will make those technologies more affordable and more viable everywhere else as well, because technologies don't really know boundaries, at least not the technology per se. Of course, there's things like intellectual property, etc. But the technology development itself, usually you don't see it falling back again. That's, once you have it, it is something that can then be shared and is shared elsewhere, or in fact, it just diffuses, as technology diffusion experts say. So with that, I would say those are my two main points to how the US changes from the election last month may affect and probably will affect what happens in India.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful answer. And to take it up from there on carbon emission and on renewable energy, as we all know, in the G20 summit for climate held in November 2020, the Indian Prime Minister said that India has far exceeded the expectations of the Paris Agreement, and it also reiterated India's stand on International Solar Alliance. So what do you think is the implication of this? Do you think that a call for an International Solar Alliance on the international platform would directly translate into positive domestic policies? What is your take on this?
So, I want to be cautious not to comment on policy in India from an outsider perspective. That would seem to me risky and impolite as well, because I'm not close enough to really say what's going well and not going well, but I will give some comments sort of as an outsider that I think have general validity. And that is that I think this initiative is good. I think many have said this is a situation of all hands on deck. Every actor, from states all the way down to all the different civil society actors, NGOs and so on, individuals, we all have to do our part to steer this global tanker, around from an unsustainable path towards a sustainable one. And it's a monumental effort that will require all of us to do our part. And I think that every effort, every initiative that draws attention to this, that raises the profile of this challenge and the ways to deal with it, and in the case of the International Solar Alliance, more so even, highlights the benefits and opportunities and sort of rallies other countries to come together and seize those opportunities and explore, and research together and share best practices. This is eminently helpful. I see no downside at all. And I think this is something that hopefully, will spill over not only to action on the ground in India, which is spearheading this, but also many of these other countries that have expressed interest in participating or are participating. Where do I see some of the barriers and challenges that I think can be focused on? I think, as I said earlier, the technologies have they are diffusing. Even though, again, there are barriers to technology transfer across nations, the market has its way to get these technologies out, like solar photovoltaic. And Germany, for instance, thought that it would become a champion by investing heavily and developing and building these, but it shifted over to China, and most of it is now manufactured in China and some other East and Southeast Asian nations. And so that part is still important to continue developing the technology, continue driving down the cost, improving the efficiency and longevity, for instance, of solar photovoltaic modules. But I see another big area that is much more country specific, again, because to me, technology is something which eventually, whether you like it or not, will transcend borders and will be shared. Even if politicians try to prevent that, it doesn't work. Germany tried that. They lost the whole photovoltaic industry. And I think to the benefit of the world, because China is able to manufacture them cheaper and other countries. And so everywhere, we can import these technologies at lower costs. So for the climate, that's been a good thing. For German industry, it's not been a good thing, but that's a tangent. Let me focus on where I see country-specific issues that I hope the International Solar Alliance can help with. And that's also something that I presume and expect will be an issue in India. And that is that you do also need to have domestically in your legal and institutional framework architecture, you need to have enabling circumstances and conditions and rules on planning, siting, permitting of renewable energy installations, processes and procedures to allow more transmission infrastructure, generally network infrastructure, even for charging of electric vehicles and so on. Those are where I see the bigger challenges, at least based on the experience, say, in the United States and in Europe, because it is not easy to do those things. It becomes very political very quickly. There's a lot of competing interests and legitimate competing interests that have to be balanced out. And at some point, it's no longer the cost of the technology, the availability of the technology, but it's rather the ability to deploy them swiftly and with smooth procedures and without inciting civil protests and civil debate that is slowing down this. And again, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of having that debate. In many cases, some of the ideas to cite a large scale, utility scale, massive solar farm in a certain location was a really bad idea. And it was really good that civil society was able to speak up, participate in the process and block it, or have the planning change and explore alternatives. But again, these are time-consuming processes. And so that's, I think, something where the International Solar Alliance can maybe help build learning and build best practices, if you like, and share lessons on how to do that in a way that both is equitable and respects concerns from civil society, but still enables countries to move forward at the speed that they need to move forward to achieve their own commitments and targets with deploying renewable energy. So that would be in a nutshell sort of my attempt, without commenting too much on India specifically, to say how I think that the International Solar Alliance and what India's role in that could really be very, very beneficial.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this. And I think from here, I was really deeply interested in you talking about civil society response. So I would really, take it forward the next question from there. As we all know, the Mumbai Metro project was supposed to expand by compromising on 25,000 trees in and around the RA forest. And this drew a massive response from a large section of civil society people, which ultimately resulted in the state government shifting the car shed and looking for a different location for it. So there has been, globally as well as in India, a greater rise in the acceptance of civil society discourses on climate change. So where do you see this new kind of climate activism, and its potential in terms of influencing climate mitigation policy in India?
It's a very, very good question. And it is one that is being faced all around the world. Different names, of course, different cities, different areas, different groups, but this very similar questions. And it echoes, I think, a broader trend, not only in India, but around the world, even under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to afford non-state actors a more important role in dealing with the climate challenge, with climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that goes back to what I said earlier, because we recognize, A, this is an all hands on deck problem. We need to mobilize all our forces, all our resources, but also B, as I was hinting at in my previous, in the answer to the previous question, the solutions, both the problems resulting from climate change, the impacts, etc., but also the solutions, the responses, have very vast distributional implications. They affect multiple interests, and sometimes what might be most effective for dealing with climate change and reducing emissions, for instance, in this case, helping accelerate the expansion of public transportation, which tends to be a lower emissions, a lower carbon alternative to other forms of mobility, is not going to be necessarily the best thing for biodiversity, for well-being in an urban environment, for the rights of citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And so balancing those interests out, those sometimes contending interests, is really, really difficult. I have heard cynics say, that's why China is in such a good position. They just decree from the top and things happen, and I instinctively cringe a bit when I hear that, but there is probably some truth in that. Things can go really fast when you don't have to deal with these debates, these societal debates. But it comes at a cost. And I think the cost is that not all voices will have been heard and not all concerns will have been balanced right in the right way. And so my hope is that we are able to harness this plurality of views and voices and concerns when the driver for an initiative is one specific goal, one specific objective that may ignore some other concerns and some contending interests and rights, et cetera, that we're able to bring in all these views, but in a way that still allows us to sort of achieve the overarching goals without slowing that down. And to me, I've thought about it very much in the international context. Is it a legitimate, are the net effects of having more participation of business, for instance, of civil society groups like environmental NGOs, of cities, et cetera, in international cooperation, which traditionally used to only be states? And I've concluded there are, many critics point out, what's with accountability? What's with transparency of such efforts? What's with the legitimacy ultimately if it's done by powerful? One group is powerful, but it's not representing necessarily the majority, especially when you have industry, trade associations, et cetera. So I think the challenge is really to make sure that these actors, these groups that are not, coming from that are not elected officials and where you don't have the whole legitimacy in inducing process of elections, et cetera, but come from the bottom up and where it's a little bit more chaotic, sometimes more anarchic, have to be held up, I think, to the same standard, that they have to represent, plurality of views, have to be transparent, have to be accountable if they pledge certain things. And I think a way to ensure that is just that you make sure, something that I've seen come up in many countries, in many contexts, is to have committees, committees that try to be as representative of the various groups as possible, that have civil society in there, that may have business, that may have obviously public policy, et cetera. And those, I think, have been very good fora to, in a legitimate way and in a transparent way, bring all those voices together. And so I encourage and support the fact that, there have been protests and that citizens affected by this, and also people who were just concerned about the forest and wanted to make sure that that valuable heritage is not lost, came forward and protested against it. And I would also encourage, in order to make sure that it doesn't become a growing obstacle to another very important objective, advancing climate policy in the country, as it has become in some countries, even in Germany, for instance, to make sure that there are processes in place that satisfy that need for participation and for hearing all voices, but in a somewhat more streamlined and more transparent way than purely having it sort of be ad hoc and improvised every single case. That would be sort of my attempt to streamline this, or to make sure that you can balance those two objectives of being able to move forward with certain policies that sometimes are difficult and have effects, but hearing everybody in order to make sure that the policies do accommodate all the concerns, and in some cases really have to be changed because some of those concerns are extremely important and overriding. It may be an unsatisfactory answer, but again, it is born out of observing how in many contexts, policymakers weren't prepared for this and things just fell apart. And in the end, we do also know that we need to move forward with climate policy. So we need to have a way that is mature and robust to deal with these contending interests. That's why I'm suggesting, trying to find such procedures that do so from the outset, that it's from the outset clear there will be protests, there will be civil society voices reflected in this process that may not, that may slow down things, but we're prepared for that and we're taking that into account from the beginning.
Thank you, sir. And I can see very interesting questions in the chat box in this context. So if you would like to, I can read out one question and probably you can answer it.
Absolutely.
Hi, Dr. Mehling. It's from Manisha Kakkar. Hi, Dr. Mehling. In developing countries, especially in India, Climate crisis is not a discussion among the civilians. Common man in large does not understand the importance of climate. How can the general public be brought into the discourse?
Well, Manisha, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. It is something that 5 years ago here in the United States was very valid equally. I think that it is one, though, that will sort of resolve itself. And the pessimistic reason why I think that is the case is that the impacts are becoming more and more visible and felt. And many of those impacts, as you know, are very painful. And whenever you have a veritable crisis, and I think it's fair to call climate change at this point already a crisis, a growing number of countries and states and cities are formally and officially calling it a crisis now to help focus action and leverage some additional opportunities for policy development, etc., which has its own downsides and is problematic in its own right. When things suddenly become very urgent and have to move very fast, that's precisely when you may start stepping on those rights and interests and voices that I was mentioning before that we have to listen to and have to incorporate and balance in this whole process. But again, I think that just the physical realities of climate change are becoming such that the debate will inevitably also start permeating more and more in Indian society. And I would be willing to bet that now in 2020, you probably already have more discussion, even among segments of society that 5 years ago wouldn't have really had any opinion on climate change. But it is a process, it takes time. And I think it's important to do it in a deliberate way and not rush into sort of a panic mode, but really, and I think government plays a very important role, but so do all these other actors from civil society groups, NGOs, of course, schools and universities, research, so the research community, but business, trade as well. And here in the US, I think the latter, for instance, has played a very large role because shareholders have exerted pressure on companies. Trade associations nowadays know that they have to speak to the topic. And so all these different actors, I think, together accelerate. It becomes like a snowball. Well, maybe in India, this is not a good example, except in the very north of the country. It becomes a snowball, but if you know what I mean, it starts growing and growing as it rolls downhill. And so I think that it won't take long before the general public is going to be much more involved in this discourse. Unfortunately, again, the reason being that the problems caused by climate change have become more palpable and more widely felt.
Thank you, sir. We have another set of really interesting questions, and I think it's a bit different from the context in which you were speaking, but I'm sure you would be the perfect person to address this. It's a question by Abhishek Padmanabhan. So it says, the Green New Deal in the US includes a significant component directed at reversing economic inequality. Is this a viable method from an American context, and can such a thing be successfully applied in the Indian context?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. I saw you had two questions. I was preparing for the first one, but I think your second one is in fact even more important, Abhishek, because as I was mentioning earlier, we realize increasingly as we become serious about dealing with climate change, and a big part of that is not just thinking about adaptation, resilience, and so on, the impact, but about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions all around the world, not just in, as formerly, the focus was on industrialized countries, but it is a fact also that, the growth, economic growth in particular, is now elsewhere. And so emissions are also growing faster in other parts of the world, in emerging economies like India, China, and so on, are an important part of that equation. So, but dealing with emissions, reducing emissions, has very, very significant impacts throughout society and throughout the economy. In the United States, this is, I think, something that has been more palpable and more serious than, say, in Europe. And I think a part of that is that, there are more, North America, the United States is just such an expansive country. So there are entire regions that are dependent on heavy industry or on natural resources like coal, oil, gas, etc. And when you say that you commit to net zero emissions by mid-century, as Joe Biden is pledging to do once he is in office, then you invariably are also saying that some of this heavy industry, car manufacturing, for instance, but especially also those parts of the country that are currently dependent on fossil fuels, coal extraction and mining, gas, oil, etc. That source of their livelihood will disappear. And it's not only the miners themselves or the oil platform workers, etc. It's the entire community around them. You have, for every coal worker, you may have 10, 12, 15 people who are sort of depending on that value. Oops. Sorry, it's my father calling me from Germany, and it keeps always, oops, end call. And somehow I managed to activate an emergency call now, trying to stop his. I'll just deactivate the phone now. All right, there we go. So in parts of Appalachia, for instance, and I'm sure, if you look to India, you would see a counterpart to Appalachia or to North Dakota or to Texas, where these basic industries where extracting resources or very carbon intensive industry are just the fabric of the economy there. You will have villages, towns, etc., where a handful of coal miners finance everything, and essentially it's the coal mine that is the sustenance of the stores and of the schools and of the hospital and everything there. And there's been this growing concern here in the United States that if you want to phase out those industries, you have to offer them an alternative. It's not only a question of equity, it's even just of feasibility, of survival, really, if you like. And so, yes, it's become one of the major topics has been this idea that there has to be a just transition. There has to be a pathway forward, even for the communities that will be heavily impacted. And again, I think a country such as India that has robust heavy industry, that has natural resources, that has sectors of the economy that depend currently on activities which contribute to emissions, offering those, identifying and offering, engaging those communities early on, starting a debate and investing also, making sure that the distributional impacts are understood and there's processes in place, job training, kickstarting alternatives, for instance, for the car manufacturers here in this country, making sure that there are viable alternatives that these companies and the workers there can continue working on, like electric vehicles and so on. So it's going to be really important. It's important in Europe, but even more so here in North America. And I think it will be a big topic in other parts of the world, especially countries like India, China, Brazil, and so on, where these effects, these impacts of decarbonization will be great as well.
Thank you, sir. And in that context, I'm really interested in your take on Abhishek's first question as well. So I'll read out the question. How does carbon pricing get implemented in the economy with large informal or undocumented component, such as in India?
Well, I don't know if there is a good answer for that. Well, I think there is an answer, but you're right. I mean, this is a very serious consideration to take into account when discussing carbon pricing. There's different ways to do carbon pricing. There's some very, very complicated ones, but there are some that are a bit simpler. And what I would suggest, and I think India has already to some extent explored, now I don't know to what extent the informal economy has been a major problem there, but is to look upstream. I think that the carbon or the coal cess, and one of the participants here, a former student of mine, looked at that during the studies some years ago at Strathclyde University in Scotland. Something that targets a handful of very large companies upstream again, at the point of where these fuels enter the market. You only deal with, and if you wanted to expand from coal to oil, gas, etc., then you deal with the refiners and producers that introduce these fuels to the market. It's a few dozen usually. For all of Europe, there's only a handful, let's say, of companies, and they are manageable. They are understood. They are as transparent as can be, I guess, because they can't escape. They can't hide. They're not informal. That's what I'm trying to say. And they will pass through the carbon price as they sell their products to the next level in the value chain, the distributors, the gas stations, and so on. And those in turn pass it through. So instead of trying to get small businesses and individuals even to sort of have to pay a carbon price directly, which I agree would be a huge challenge when you have such a large share of the economy that is not necessarily transparent and reporting. It's not even necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it's worked traditionally, where it makes it hard to have sort of obligations that are then monitored and enforced, etc. I would say you target very much at the upstream, these large companies, some of them even probably partly state-owned, and implement it there and look for that price to be passed through the value chain all the way down to the consumer. The only thing that one has to really be careful there, though, at the same time, is there's this tendency in many countries, at least, to be concerned about consumer energy prices, and so it's inevitably unproductive to try to implement a cost increase based on the carbon content at the upstream level, but then contain energy costs or limit energy costs with subsidies even at the consumer level. So for that carbon signal to pass through the whole value chain, you invariably have to make sure that you're not capping prices in a way that is counterproductive or applying subsidies. And if there we get back to these issues where we have to balance social concerns, economic hardship with climate policy. And again, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I fully recognize that in some cases, low-income households need to be protected against the energy cost increase that such an upstream carbon price would induce. And a way to do that is to use part of the revenue and specifically channel some revenue back to low-income households. But again, that's where the informal part of the economy may make it harder to ensure that that is spread equitably and comprehensively, that revenue that is recycled to avert such equity or hardship, economic hardship. So there's many questions, but that I guess would be the easiest way still to target a carbon price upstream, have it pass through the economy, and then have some part of the revenue be available to ensure that the poorest households are not hit in an inequitable way, because it can be a regressive tax depending on circumstances.
Thank you, sir. Due to the paucity of time, I'll have to move to my last question, which is going to be a COVID-specific question. So there is a growing idea among a section of policymakers that the major effects of the pandemic on livelihood, or for instance, unemployment, all of these issues need to be addressed first before we actually think about something like climate. What is your take on this, and where do you see in India, in the post-pandemic world, dealing with climate mitigation? A very short response.
Absolutely. Well, okay. A short response to a question that I think has no answers yet. I've looked at I've done some research on the effects of the pandemic earlier this year on emissions. And as you probably have heard, emissions around the globe haven't fallen as much as they have this year since World War II, which was another shock, if you like, to the global economy, and with that to the activities that emit greenhouse gases. And many were saying, well, you know what? It shows that we can do it. We can reduce emissions. And finally, at the level and at the scale that scientists tell us are needed in order to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement, the temperature stabilization targets of the Paris Agreement, and more generally to avert catastrophic climate change. The small problem is these emissions reductions came at huge sacrifice. It was shuttering business, it was closing down cities, it was locking down entire countries. And so obviously, I think, it doesn't take much to agree that this is not a blueprint for all future years to achieve these 7-8% global emissions reductions that indeed we are told by science we need to achieve. But I think there were some opportunities in that. There were some lessons that we've learned and in things in certain segments, especially in transportation, that maybe some of the business travel, some of the business meetings, etc., some of the commuting, some of the shopping, etc., may indeed be with modern technologies, such as what we're using right now. Some of that can perhaps be substituted, which is useful and helps us reduce emissions. But it's only a small chunk. It's not nowhere near, the scale of these massive emissions reductions we've seen this year. Where I see a bigger opportunity is the fact that interest rates are low. Countries are willing to take debt, which of course has its whole sort of follow-on, knock-on problems, etc., with fiscal discipline and overspent the budgets and interest and so on and so forth. But interest rates are low, and we have an economy that is struggling around the world in every country. And we also know that we need up to $500 billion or more in additional investment around the world in clean infrastructure, clean technology deployment, etc. If you put those two things together, I think that it does suggest what many have said, Lord Stern, others around the world, Joe Stiglitz, this is a good opportunity to take on debt for countries, for governments, and to invest very heavily in a green recovery, to invest very heavily in stimulating the economy, but by investing in things such as green infrastructure, public transportation, deploying renewable energy technology, creating jobs, showing that you have jobs in the clean energy economy, which many critics, as one of your other questions would have, I think, asked, many critics still contend is not possible. It's either development or climate policy, but it's not both. Not true. And you can show it if you start really building that clean energy economy coming out of this crisis. And because interest rates are low, I think it is a time where one can really credibly consider this without risking too much headache down the road. I mean, we will have to think about how to deal with these budget deficits during our generation. But there are many crises, and we have the economic crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic that we need to recover from, and climate change. And we cannot afford to recover in an unsustainable way, because then I think we will have missed our last exit, so to speak, from this unsustainable highway.
Thank you, Dr. Mehling. We have a few more questions which we can obviously mail you, and we would like your response to that. Thank you, Dr. Mehling. We are really grateful for your wonderful insights and nuanced perspectives that you put forward throughout this discussion. I'm sure all of us have a lot to take away from this. A special thanks to the audience for your participation and engagement and all the brilliant questions. Have a great day ahead, sir. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you very much. Dhanyavad. Bye-bye.